The aroma of leather and antiquated books permeated the federal courthouse where I was seated opposite District Judge Jamie, presenting him with documentation of corruption within the HOA. Just then, my phone vibrated with a security notification that sent a chill down my spine. Displayed on the screen was Brenda Thornwick, our HOA president, breaking into my lake cabin, located 200 meters away. The crack of shattering wood echoed through my phone's speaker as she forced open the back door. Judge Jamie leaned in for a closer look at the screen. "Is that unfolding right now?" he asked. Brenda was completely unaware that federal agents were already in position surrounding my property. She had no clue that the judge was witnessing her commit a felony in real time, and she certainly had no inkling that her 3-year intimidation campaign against military families was on the verge of landing her in a federal penitentiary. You see, when you interfere with the wrong veteran's property, while he's in a meeting with a federal judge about your criminal activities, well, we refer to that as perfect timing. What would you do if your HOA president unlawfully entered your home while you were compiling a federal case against them? Leave a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from. I'm willing to bet some of you have also had to contend with tyrannical HOA leaders. My name is Marcus Kelly, and just 6 months prior, I believed I had discovered my own slice of heaven. Following a 30-year career in telecommunications engineering and a substantial return from some patents I had developed, I took an early retirement to renovate my grandfather's lake cabin in Pine Lake, Montana. The property had belonged to our family since 1967, featuring weathered cedar siding, a handcrafted stone fireplace, and a dock extending into water so pristine you could spot trout swimming 20 feet below. The morning coffee simply had a better flavor there, with steam rising from my cup as the calls of loons echoed across the placid water, accompanied by the familiar creak of the old dock beneath my boots. It was pure tranquility. My wife, Sarah, was enthusiastic about the prospect of transforming it into a retreat center for veterans, and our teenage daughter, Emma, had already laid claim to the loft bedroom with its view of the lake. Then I was introduced to Brenda Thornwick. Imagine a woman who wields a leather folder like a cudgel and pilots a white SUV so immaculate you would assume it receives a daily factory detailing. Brenda had served as the HOA president for 6 years, managed a local real estate agency, and possessed the sort of sharp facial features that seemed perpetually fixed in a state of disapproval. On the day she presented herself, I noticed the scent of her pricey perfume mingling with the fragrance of pine. In her presence, even the natural world seemed less genuine. "Welcome to Pine Lake," she stated, although her inflection implied I was not especially wanted. "I'm confident you will acquaint yourself with our community standards." Community standards? That ought to have been my first warning sign. 3 weeks later, I received my formal introduction to Brenda's interpretation of those standards. A certified letter showed up, its thick, official-looking stationery feeling costly to the touch. Inside was a $1,500 penalty for unauthorized structure modifications. The supposed infraction? My grandfather's dock extension, which was constructed in 1972. Recent satellite imaging has identified non-compliant structures on your property. Brenda clarified when I phoned her. I could distinctly hear the sound of her manicured fingernails tapping on her desk. All waterfront alterations must have current HOA approval. The absurdity of this situation was highlighted by one key fact. The HOA was not established until 1985. My grandfather's dock was built 13 years before their organization even existed. I possessed the original building permits, survey records, and even photographs of him and my father fishing from that very dock when I was a boy of 10. One would assume that providing such historical proof would resolve the issue. It did not. I attended the subsequent HOA meeting equipped with all my paperwork. The community center had an odor of burnt coffee and floor polish, with fluorescent lights humming above as about 15 individuals occupied folding chairs. I presented the photos, permits, and a timeline demonstrating that my dock was grandfathered in. Brenda hardly gave my evidence a second look. "Grandfathered structures are subject to annual compliance fees," she stated, as if she were delivering a weather report. A $500 monthly historical structure maintenance assessment that amounted to $6,000 annually for a dock that was entirely lawful at the time of its construction. It was then that I began to perceive a pattern. Throughout the meeting, I overheard hushed discussions among other residents, which would cease abruptly whenever Brenda glanced in their direction. An elderly neighbor, Gladys, discreetly shared that she had observed similar issues affecting other military families. Following the meeting, I began to investigate, Over the past 2 years, 3 veteran families had been subjected to escalating fines. 2 of them had sold their homes. As it happened, both properties were sold through Brenda's real estate firm. The smell of diesel from the parking lot blended with my escalating suspicion as I sat in my truck afterward. This was not about dock regulations or community standards. This was a deliberate effort to drive out veterans. Here is the lesson I wish I had understood then. When an HOA suddenly starts identifying violations on properties belonging to individuals from a particular demographic, you are not merely contending with red tape, you are contending with discrimination, and discrimination, particularly when aimed at veterans, has the potential to become a federal offense. But I was about to learn that lesson the difficult way. 2 weeks after that community meeting, Brenda raised the stakes. She appeared at my cabin without warning on a Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand, accompanied by a man she introduced as Dale, who was purportedly a county inspector. The scent of stale tobacco smoke and inexpensive aftershave preceded them up my gravel driveway. Dale seemed as though he would prefer to be anywhere else, constantly looking at Brenda like a skittish dog awaiting instructions. His county inspector badge was attached crookedly to a shirt that had clearly seen better decades. "Routine safety inspection," Brenda declared, moving past me without asking for permission. "We've had multiple complaints regarding electrical hazards near the water." Multiple complaints from whom? I was the sole occupant of this property. I trailed them around my cabin, observing as Dale indicated perfectly legal GFCI outlets, the type specifically engineered for outdoor use in proximity to water. Each time he seemed to waver, Brenda would audibly clear her throat and tap her pen on that leather folder. The metallic clicking grated on my nerves. "This outlet is dangerously close to the waterline," Dale muttered, taking a photo of a GFCI that was, in reality, 15 feet from the shore and fully compliant with code. I had installed it myself, drawing on my background in electrical engineering. "And this fire pit?" Brenda chimed in with feigned concern, gesturing toward my grandfather's weathered stone circle. "Appears to be entirely unpermitted." I nearly burst out laughing. Unpermitted? It was a circle of fieldstones my grandfather had set by hand in the 1960s. I possessed photographs of 3 generations of my family roasting marshmallows over those very same rocks. However, Brenda showed no interest in family legacy. The list of violations expanded like a malignancy: a $1,500 fine for electrical noncompliance, another $1,200 for the unpermitted recreational fire feature, a further $1,500 for failing to uphold adequate waterfront safety standards. On top of that, there were $300 monthly monitoring fees to guarantee continued compliance. The total financial penalty was $4,200, with an additional $300 draining from my account each month thereafter. That evening, sleep eluded me. The unfairness of it all churned in my stomach like a bad cup of coffee. Consequently, I did what any retired telecom engineer would do. I conducted research. In Montana, all building inspectors are required to hold state certification, with their licenses being publicly accessible online via the Department of Labor. Dale's name was nowhere in the database, but Dale Morrison, real estate agent at Thornwick Properties. There it was. My father used to say that when someone is attempting to defraud you, they often become careless. It appears that fraudulent building inspectors, like everyone else, leave a digital trail. This was a principle I had learned from years of working with contractors. Always confirm credentials before accepting someone's authority over your property. I submitted a formal complaint to the state licensing board first thing on Wednesday morning. Then I adopted a strategic approach. From that moment on, all communications with Brenda would be conducted via email. No more phone conversations where she could later deny her statements or distort my words. But Brenda's intimidation campaign was only just beginning. Within a matter of days, anonymous noise complaints about my restoration work started to surface. Work that was perfectly legal and conducted between the hours of 9 to 00 a.m. and 5 to 00 p.m. New parking restrictions appeared overnight, with signs placed in a manner seemingly calculated to make accessing my own property difficult. The sound of Brenda's heels on the pavement became my personal early warning signal. She would patrol the area, like a prison guard, invariably clutching that leather folder and photographing something. It was at this point that I made a decision that would alter the course of everything. Security cameras. I set up a discrete system that covered my driveway, dock, and the public spaces where Brenda frequently conducted her surveillance. The footage from the first week was more rewarding than Christmas morning. It captured Brenda at 11 p.m. a.m. on a Thursday, measuring my dock while Dale held a flashlight. They took photographs of it from various angles, clearly assembling a case for more violations. But the part that made my blood run cold was this. They weren't just documenting my property. I observed them carrying out identical late-night inspections at 3 other residences, all of which were owned by veterans. 2 weeks of video footage established the pattern. Brenda's immaculate white SUV was making regular midnight visits to properties owned by military families. She would photograph, measure, and document her findings at hours when she believed no one was observing. The definitive evidence, however, came from the enhanced audio of a particularly sharp recording. Brenda was standing in my driveway at midnight with her phone held to her ear. "The Kelly property should be a simple matter," she said to someone on the line. "These military types invariably break under sustained pressure. A few more fines and he'll be eager to sell for less than its market value." The diesel. Fumes from her SUV lingered in my driveway long after she had departed. But now they smelled like concrete proof. I possessed video of systematic harassment, fraudulent inspections, and discriminatory targeting based on veteran status. It was time to reverse the situation. Armed with proof of Brenda's covert nighttime surveillance operation, I believed I had her trapped. I was mistaken. Rather than retreating, she intensified her efforts with legal threats. The certified letter was delivered on costly law firm letterhead, the type of heavy, embossed paper intended to make your hands tremble as you open it. "Cease and desist all unauthorized activities" was emblazoned across the top in bold letters that seemed to jump from the page. The message was unambiguous. Pay the $7,800 in accrued fines within 30 days or risk having a lien placed on my property. Not only had my initial violations supposedly increased due to compounding daily fines, but new charges for ongoing noncompliance and failure to respond to official HOA communications had been added. The scent of fresh ink and legal coercion filled my kitchen as I reread every word. Yet, something about the entire situation felt amiss. The law firm, Hartwell & Associates, had a Helena address, but a Google search revealed a website that appeared to have been created in 2003 and subsequently forgotten. That afternoon, I made the drive to the county courthouse, a limestone structure that smelled of decades of officialdom and floor polish. Having spent years navigating municipal permits, I knew that genuine legal threats create a paper trail. In the dimly lit basement records room, I located what I had been searching for. The original HOA formation documents from 1985. As I took pictures of each page with my phone, the musty odor of old documents making me sneeze, I stumbled upon something significant. The current CCNRs, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that supposedly granted Brenda such extensive authority, were markedly different from the initial documents. Substantial alterations had been made over time, including the establishment of the historical structure assessment that was costing me $500 a month. But the detail that made my heart race was this: those amendments mandated the approval of 75% of the homeowners. I discovered meeting minutes, voting records, and even proxy statements. The majority of Brenda's rule modifications had been approved by slim margins, frequently with less than half of the community even in attendance. My grandfather, during his time in construction, had always taught me to scrutinize contracts. "The devil is in the details," he would often say, "and the angels are in the original signatures." It turns out that invalid rule changes are essentially worthless when challenged in federal court. But my inquiry was on the verge of revealing something far more significant. I began to contact the displaced veteran families, those who had been compelled to sell their homes due to Brenda's campaigns of harassment. Pete Michaels, a Desert Storm veteran, had been forced out 6 months prior. It was the same strategy, Pete explained over coffee at a diner that smelled of bacon and regret. It began with dock violations, followed by electrical complaints, and before I knew it, I was facing $12,000 in fines for a shed my father-in-law had built in 1992. Pete's voice wavered slightly. "I sold it for $180,000 just to get out from under the legal fees. 3 months later, Brenda's company resold it for $320,000. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Identify a veteran family, fabricate violations, escalate fines until the financial strain forces a sale below market value. Then, resell the property through Brenda's real estate network for a substantial profit. I submitted complaints to the State Real Estate Commission, detailing the conflict of interest between Brenda's role in HOA enforcement and her property sales business. But she wasn't going to wait for regulatory bodies to act. My mailbox was spray-painted with the word troublemaker in red letters that resembled blood against the white metal. Anonymous notes started appearing under my windshield wipers. Military types don't belong in family neighborhoods. And some people never learn when they're not wanted. The psychological pressure was taking a toll on my family. Emma began to ask if we could return to town. Sarah would startle at the sound of a car door closing in our driveway. The serene retreat we had envisioned was turning into a battleground. But the final escalation occurred when I found that someone had attempted to break into my cabin. I was in town purchasing supplies when my security system triggered an alert on my phone. The footage showed Brenda's white SUV parked at the end of our street, its engine idling like a getaway vehicle. An individual had approached my back door. The camera angle did not reveal who it was, but fresh scratches around the lock and disturbed gravel made it clear. Someone had tried to enter my home that evening. As Sarah and I reviewed the footage, we both observed something unsettling. The attempted break-in took place during the precise hours when Brenda knew I would be in town. Information she could have only obtained by systematically observing my daily habits. "This is no longer about money," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is personal." She was correct. But what Brenda did not realize was that her escalating harassment had drawn the notice of someone with the genuine authority to put a stop to it. 3 days following the attempted break-in, Brenda deployed her ultimate strategy. A notice was placed in every mailbox in Pine Lake, cheap paper with smeared ink that spoke to the hasty, desperate nature of her plan. Emergency HOA meeting. Addressing disruptive residents threatening community safety. The meeting was set for Thursday at 2 p.m. In the middle of a workday when most responsible individuals would be at their jobs, the agenda was cloaked in legal terminology. But the intent was unmistakable. They intended to vote on foreclosing on my property for a pattern of violations endangering community welfare. I spent Tuesday evening contacting every neighbor I felt I could rely on, making quiet phone calls after Sarah and Emma had gone to sleep. The hushed conversations revealed a troubling reality. Gladys, the elderly woman who lived 2 doors away, disclosed something that made my stomach clench. My Harold, God rest his soul, experienced the same thing before he died, she said, her voice shaking over the phone. A Korean War veteran, a decorated soldier. They claimed his workshop violated noise ordinances, that his American flag was too large for community standards. The stress, she couldn't complete the thought. Harold had suffered a fatal heart attack 6 months into his conflict with Brenda. Thursday came with the kind of overcast Montana sky that seems laden with an impending storm. The community center reeked of industrial cleaner and old coffee, with fluorescent lights humming overhead. Like agitated hornets, folding chairs were set up to limit seating, a calculated move to discourage attendance. Only 12 of the 40 homeowners attended. Brenda had filled the room with her supporters. Dale, 2 real estate agents from her firm, and several residents who had curiously received reductions in their own HOA fines the week before. "Thank you all for attending to discuss this pressing issue," Brenda started, positioned behind a podium as if she were giving a sermon. Her presentation slides were professionally done, too professional for an emergency community meeting. She had orchestrated an entire performance, complete with aerial photographs of my property marked with red circles around supposed violations, charts illustrating declining property values in our area, and testimonials from concerned residents about my aggressive behavior and disruptive construction activities. But it was the most inflammatory slide that made my blood boil. It displayed a photograph of me in my army dress uniform from Emma's school career day, with text superimposed that read, "Military training, asset or liability in family communities?" The message was starkly clear. Veterans are inherently a threat. Studies indicate that military personnel often face challenges with civilian reintegration. Brenda continued, her tone adopting a concerned, almost condescending quality. "While we are grateful for their service, we must put the safety and stability of our families first." I remained in the back row, legally recording the entire proceeding on my phone. Montana's one-party consent law was about to prove invaluable. Every discriminatory remark, every fabricated accusation, every infringement on my civil rights was being captured. When Brenda opened the floor for community feedback, 3 neighbors came to my defense. Tom Rivera, a retired educator, stated that I had assisted him in repairing his dock after the spring floods. Margaret Jamie noted my volunteer efforts with the local VFW. Even the reserved Mrs. Patterson rose to say that my restoration project was restoring beauty to our lake. But Brenda was prepared for opposition. She presented a folder of witness statements, typed documents asserting that I had threatened board members, disrupted the peace with loud power tools at unsuitable times, and made suspicious modifications to my property that could put neighbors at risk. I saw Dale's signature on 2 of the statements. The others were signed by the individuals who had received those unexplained fine reductions. If we fail to take decisive action, Brenda proclaimed, her voice escalating to what seemed like practiced hysteria, we will be subject to lawsuits from other homeowners for not upholding community standards. Property values will decline. Families will be compelled to move. The vote was a foregone conclusion, achieved through procedural manipulation. My vote was disallowed as the subject of the enforcement action. Abstentions were counted as support for foreclosure, and the process was hurried through before anyone could voice procedural objections. The result was 8 votes for foreclosure and 4 against. But here is what Brenda did not know. My phone had recorded more than just her fabricated evidence and procedural abuses. During a short break, believing the recording had been paused, she had leaned toward Dale and whispered something that would alter everything. Military people devalue neighborhoods. That's common knowledge. Once we remove the Kellys and that Martinez family, we can promote this as an exclusive family community. No more PTSD issues or government dependency. The room was utterly silent after the vote. Like the lull before thunder follows lightning, I rose slowly, my phone still recording. I thank everyone for their time today, I said with composure. I will, of course, be appealing this decision through the appropriate legal avenues, but I want all of you to be aware that discrimination against veterans is a federal offense, and everything spoken here today is now part of an official record. Brenda's face turned ashen, but she quickly regained her composure. Empty threats will not alter a lawful vote, Mr. Kelly. As I made my way to the exit, Harold's widow, Gladys, discreetly slipped a folded piece of paper into my hand. In shaky script were a phone number and 5 words. Call him, he can help. The phone number Gladys provided led to the most significant conversation I've ever had. Marcus, this is Judge William Jamie. Gladys mentioned you might be in touch. I almost dropped my coffee. Harold's unassuming widow had put me in contact with a federal district judge, her son-in-law. Judge, I'm grateful you took my call, but I'm not certain this warrants federal attention. Hold on right there, he cut in, his voice possessing the calm authority of someone used to being obeyed. I've been tracking patterns of HOA discrimination across Montana for the last 18 months. Your situation isn't an isolated incident, Mr. Kelly, it's a component of something far larger. That Friday morning, I was in Judge Jamie's chambers in Helena, enveloped by law books and the gravity of true justice. Sunlight poured through tall windows, creating long shadows over files stamped confidential that littered his desk. 23 HOAs in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, he stated, unfolding a map, marked with red pins. All exhibit identical patterns of targeting military families, the same escalation methods, the same financial pressure tactics, the same coerced sales below market value. My hands shook slightly as he presented me with federal subpoenas that had already been served for the financial records of Thornwick Properties and 24 similar entities. The scale of it was immense. Hundreds of veteran families systematically displaced from their homes. The notable aspect of your case, Marcus, is the timing. We've been constructing this investigation for months, but we required someone who was still actively resisting, someone who had evidence and the resolve to wear a wire, federal witness protection, RICO charges for racketeering. The legal jargon spun around me like a whirlwind of debris, but a single truth cut through the haze. I wasn't losing my mind. This wasn't typical HOA bureaucracy, it was a criminal conspiracy. Brenda's enterprise has generated approximately $2.3 million in profits from coerced veteran property sales over 3 years. Judge Jamie explained, his finger following lines on financial documents that made my stomach tighten. Email exchanges between her and collaborators in 6 states discuss clearing out military problems and upgrading neighborhood demographics. The crucial evidence was an email chain titled Operation Clean Sweep. which read like a document from a 1950s segregationist manual. Brenda and her network had created a methodical playbook for targeting veteran families. Identify military backgrounds through public records, fabricate violations with fraudulent inspectors, increase financial strain with compounding fines, and then move in with below-market purchase offers via shell companies. Your nighttime surveillance footage was the final piece of the puzzle, Judge Jamie clarified. When combined with the discriminatory remarks you recorded at yesterday's meeting, we have sufficient grounds for federal civil rights charges, mail fraud, and a RICO conspiracy. But it was what he said next that made my pulse race. They needed me to continue my public fight while federal agents operated covertly, maintain the appearance of vulnerability, allow Brenda to believe she was winning. We need her to escalate the situation further. The more desperate she gets, the more evidence she will generate. He gave me a business card for Assistant U.S. Attorney Janet Morrison. Contact her on Monday. She will detail how federal witness protection operates and what we will require from you in the coming weeks. As I drove back to Pine Lake, the Montana scenery appeared different through my windshield. Those mountains were no longer just picturesque. They were the backdrop for a federal investigation that would unmask corruption spanning 3 states. The scattered ranches and small towns were no longer just rural communities. They were pieces of evidence in a case that could redefine how HOAs function across the country. My phone vibrated with a text from Sarah. How did the meeting turn out? I smiled for the first time in what felt like months. Better than I could have hoped, much better. That evening, as loons called across Pine Lake and Emma strummed her guitar in the loft, I sat on my grandfather's dock, watching the sunset paint the water in hues of gold and red, the very same dock Brenda had intended to use to find me into bankruptcy. The next day, I would put on an act, defeated, desperate, on the verge of surrender, but tonight, I was simply a veteran who had found allies. With the authority to combat systemic discrimination, the federal government was about to teach Brenda Thornwick that some conflicts are far greater than HOA regulations. Monday morning at the Helena Federal Building was like stepping into another dimension. Marble corridors amplified the sound of purposeful footsteps from serious individuals engaged in serious matters, and the scent of industrial-grade coffee mingled with the gravitas of federal power. Assistant U.S. Attorney Janet Morrison had the appearance of someone who could prosecute a tax cheat and complete a marathon in the same day. Her office was adorned with commendations, photos with senators, and a framed headline, "Federal Prosecutor Dismantles Massive Insurance Fraud Ring." Mr. Kelly, you are about to play a role in the most extensive HOA corruption probe in U.S. history, she stated, pushing a hefty folder across her desk. Operation Clean Sweep. We've adopted Brenda's own name for it. Involves 47 defendants across 6 states. The magnitude was astonishing. For 8 months, FBI financial crimes agents had been tracing money laundering schemes through real estate dealings. Civil rights. Investigators were compiling evidence of systematic discrimination against protected groups. Even the IRS was involved, building cases for tax evasion on undeclared profits from the coerced property sales. Your part is essential, Morrison went on. We need Brenda to escalate her campaign of harassment while federal surveillance captures every single violation. Consider yourself the bait in a highly sophisticated trap. The technical preparations were straight out of a spy film, FBI. Electronics experts equipped me with a recording device so minuscule it resembled a shirt button. Covert cameras were installed around my property by a team posing as a utility maintenance crew. Even I couldn't locate them once they were in place. Agent Sarah Kim from the Financial Crimes Division detailed how they had been following Brenda's financial trail. Bank records reveal consistent patterns, she said, indicating spreadsheets that looked like evidence of organized crime. HOA fines are funneled through shell companies. Property acquisitions are made through limited liability corporations, and profits are laundered across multiple real estate transactions. She's been cautious, but not cautious enough. The same LLC that is collecting your fines also owns the company that wants to purchase your property for less than its market value. That is a textbook definition of racketeering. My assignment was deceptively straightforward. Continue to behave like a beleaguered homeowner fighting a losing battle while federal agents collected the final pieces of evidence. Every exchange with Brenda would be recorded. Every act of harassment would be documented by professional surveillance teams. Every financial move would be monitored by federal banking investigators. But I was no longer truly on my own. The community network that Gladys had been discreetly assembling for months was more widespread than I had known. Harold's military comrades from 3 different wars had been observing, waiting, and documenting Brenda's discriminatory actions with the patience of seasoned soldiers. Chuck Martinez, a Vietnam veteran, had been maintaining meticulous logs of every questionable HOA enforcement action for 2 years. Bill Patterson, a Korea veteran, had been photographing Brenda's nocturnal surveillance with night vision gear from his security company. Even Linda Foster, a Desert Storm veteran, had been surreptitiously recording HOA meetings with a device her son had purchased for her. We have all been waiting for someone with the guts to fight this openly. Chuck told me over dinner at his kitchen table, the scent of his wife's enchiladas blending with the serious task of building a federal case. Harold died fighting these monsters by himself. You won't have to. The legal approach was brilliantly complex. RICO charges would be used to take down Brenda's entire network, enabling the federal seizure of all assets acquired through criminal activities. Civil rights violations came with mandatory minimum sentences that would imprison the conspirators for years. Mail fraud charges for using the postal service to deliver threatening legal notices based on false claims provided another layer of federal jurisdiction. Morrison had explained a vital point during our meeting. Federal civil rights statutes protect veterans as a distinct class in cases of housing discrimination. Every instance of Brenda targeting a military family for harassment was a violation of laws that override any HOA authority. Here's what most people fail to grasp about confronting HOAs, Morrison said, leaning back in her chair with the assurance of someone who had prosecuted hardened criminals. The moment they venture into civil rights violations, they forfeit all legal protections. Discriminatory enforcement based on military status is a federal crime. Full stop. The technical evidence collection was already yielding results. Forensic accountants had traced $400,000 in profits from coerced veteran property sales directly to Brenda's personal bank accounts. Digital forensics experts had retrieved email conversations discussing the removal of military problems from servers Brenda believed to be secure. Even local law enforcement was cooperating with federal agents. Sheriff Martinez, who was not related to Chuck, had been quietly compiling complaints about HOA harassment for months, creating a file that federal prosecutors could use to demonstrate a pattern of authority. Abuse. My cabin had become the nerve center of a federal operation that included dozens of agents, prosecutors, and investigators. Motion detectors watched every approach to the property. Digital recording devices captured conversations from hundreds of feet away. Emergency response units were on standby to step in if Brenda's harassment escalated to physical violence. But the most critical factor was timing. Federal prosecutors needed Brenda to elevate her campaign to overtly criminal acts. While they maintained plausible deniability of any federal involvement, let her believe she's winning. Morrison had instructed, desperate individuals make errors and errors become evidence. It was time to give Brenda enough rope to hang herself. Playing the role of the defeated homeowner proved more challenging than I anticipated. Every fiber of my being wanted to retaliate as Brenda intensified her harassment. However, federal prosecutors required her to cross distinct criminal boundaries while surveillance teams documented her every move. The initial escalation occurred on a Tuesday night around 11 p.m. I was in my kitchen reviewing federal case documents when the lights flickered and went out. It wasn't just my cabin. The entire section of the lake was plunged into darkness. Emergency lights activated, casting unsettling shadows through my windows. By the next morning, I identified the cause. Someone had intentionally cut the main power line that supplied 4 properties owned by veterans. The damage was precise and calculated. Not an act of random vandalism, but targeted sabotage meant to resemble equipment failure. The utility company's estimate for repairs made my chest ache. A $1,200 emergency service charge, plus an additional $800 for upgraded safety components mandated after the suspicious damage. But what truly infuriated me was that Brenda's property, a mere 50 yards away, never lost electricity. Federal surveillance cameras had recorded the entire event in high definition. Dale nearing the utility pole with wire cutters at 2:17 a.m., Brenda's white SUV idling nearby with its headlights off, and even the conversation where she instructed him to make it appear as if old equipment had failed. Agent Kim called that afternoon. From their point of view, it was beautifully executed. Sabotage disguised as infrastructure failure. targeting only military families. From our perspective, it's destruction of federal property, since utility lines are part of interstate commerce. But Brenda was not done with her infrastructure attacks. 3 days later, my water line inexplicably burst during the night. I was awakened by the sound of gushing water to find a geyser shooting up near my foundation, precisely where Dale had been inspecting for utility easement violations the week before. The emergency plumber came at sunrise, his boots squelching through mud that smelled of a mix of soil and despair. "This is the oddest thing," he commented, inspecting the broken pipe. "It seems like someone took a pickaxe to your main line, but they were very deliberate. They struck it exactly where the repair would be the most costly." The bill was $1,200 for the emergency call, another $800 for excavation and replacement, and the cost of temporary water while the repairs were made. The financial strain was escalating just as Brenda had intended, with the exception that federal agents were meticulously documenting each act of sabotage, creating evidence that would delight prosecutors in court. In the meantime, Brenda's campaign of psychological warfare grew more intense. Anonymous flyers began appearing around the neighborhood, displaying grainy images of me with text that posed the question, "Do you feel safe with unstable veterans in our community?" The cheap paper and blurry ink pointed to frantic late-night printing. My mailbox was vandalized 2 more times, first with troublemakers spray-painted in red, and then with "Go Home" scrawled in what strongly resembled Dale's handwriting that federal document analysis experts were already scrutinizing from his fraudulent inspection reports. Attacks on social media began to surface on local Facebook groups. Fictitious accounts with stock photo profiles circulated rumors about my aggressive behavior at community meetings, my suspicious late-night activities, and concerns about my stability due to my military service. The most unsettling escalation, however, was the pressure campaign on businesses. Brenda's real estate contacts began to reach out to local contractors, cautioning them against working with difficult homeowners who might not settle their bills or could become litigious. 2 of my suppliers abruptly started demanding cash payments instead of offering credit. The owner of the hardware store, a Vietnam veteran himself, discreetly informed me that someone had been making inquiries about my purchase history, attempting to build a narrative that I was hoarding materials for unknown reasons. The federal reaction was immediate and unseen. FBI financial crimes investigators started tracing the fake social media profiles back to their origins. Civil rights enforcement teams recorded how the business pressure tactics amounted to systematic economic harassment founded on military status. Even the U.S. Postal Service became involved, as using the mail to deliver intimidating materials based on false claims is a federal mail fraud offense. Agent Kim called with progress reports that brought a smile to my face, despite the harassment. She's ticking every box in the federal racketeering playbook: conspiracy, civil rights violations, destruction of property, mail fraud, and even wire fraud for the fake social media campaign. We could use her methods as a case study in a law school seminar on what not to do. But the psychological impact on my family was becoming severe. Emma began to have nightmares about intruders breaking into our cabin. Sarah would startle at every sound of a car door closing in our driveway. The tranquil haven we had envisioned had turned into a conflict zone, with federal agents being the only barrier between us and escalating criminal activity. The most terrifying moment was when I found fresh footprints around our cabin after a night we had spent visiting Sarah's parents in town. Someone had circled our property, checking doors and windows, and leaving muddy proof of their surveillance in the soft ground around our foundation. Federal agents had pictures of the intruder. Brenda herself, conducting a late-night reconnaissance for what prosecutors believed would be her final, desperate move. The final act commenced with a conversation that federal wiretaps recorded between Brenda and Dale on a Thursday evening. Agent Kim played the recording for me over a secure line, her voice taut with excitement. "We need direct proof of his instability." Brenda's voice crackled through the phone. "Something that demonstrates he's a threat to the community. Then we can proceed with emergency removal actions." Dale's anxious reply was barely decipherable. "What kind of proof?" "The kind that compels judges to issue restraining orders and forces an immediate property sale." Federal prosecutors had been anticipating this moment for months. Clear evidence of a conspiracy to plant fabricated evidence. Morrison's team promptly requested authorization for what they termed controlled criminal activity documentation. In other words, allowing Brenda to commit federal offenses while they recorded everything. I played my role to perfection, ensuring that neighborhood gossips overheard me telling Sarah that I would be traveling to Helena for legal meetings that weekend. The reality was more intricate. I would be conferring with federal prosecutors while surveillance teams positioned around my cabin documented whatever illicit activities Brenda had in store. On Friday afternoon, I made a public display of placing an overnight bag in my truck, mentioning loudly to Tom Rivera that I would be away until Sunday evening. Tom, who had been discreetly assisting federal agents by reporting on Brenda's movements, nodded with understanding and wished me success with my legal consultations. The journey to Helena felt like a dream. The late autumn landscape of Montana stretched out in every direction, with mountains adorned in shades of gold and copper. While federal agents maintained covert surveillance of my cabin 200 miles away, my phone streamed a live security feed showing the serene lake where federal justice was about to be served. On Saturday morning in Judge Jamie's chambers, I observed real-time surveillance footage on a secure federal monitor. Brenda's white SUV came into view at 11:47 a.m., parking behind a cluster of pine trees where she believed she would be concealed. Dale's pickup truck arrived 15 minutes later, carrying what appeared to be construction tools. She has been orchestrating this for weeks, Agent Kim whispered, fine-tuning the audio receiver to capture their conversation. We have wiretaps that show her buying fake drug paraphernalia and printing materials intended to portray you as an extremist. The break-in played out like a scene from a crime novel. Dale went to my back door with a professional lockpicking set, while Brenda acted as a lookout, constantly surveying the quiet neighborhood. Federal cameras captured every single detail. Dale's nervous perspiration, Brenda's sharp hand gestures, and the meticulous way they avoided touching door handles to prevent leaving fingerprints. Judge Jamie leaned in as Dale successfully picked the lock. 30 years on the federal bench, and I have never witnessed criminals creating the evidence for their own prosecution in real time. Inside my cabin, Brenda and Dale operated with practiced efficiency. Federal surveillance showed them placing items around my property. Fake extremist pamphlets in my bedroom dresser, counterfeit drug paraphernalia in my workshop, and even forged documents implying I had been making threats against HOA board members. But their most critical error was the conversation that federal microphones recorded while they worked. Once we take pictures of this evidence. Tomorrow, Brenda whispered, completely unaware that federal agents were capturing every word. Emergency restraining orders will compel an immediate property seizure. The Martinez family will see the consequences for troublemakers and will accept our offer without a fight. Dale's reply cemented their downfall. And what about the other veterans? The ones who haven't made any trouble yet. The same approach, Brenda answered coldly. Military people do not belong in family neighborhoods. We are performing a service, improving communities one property at a time. Federal agents had just documented a systematic civil rights conspiracy in high-definition audio and video. The arrests were made as they were finishing their work. FBI agents moved with military-like precision, surrounding my cabin just as Brenda and Dale stepped out the back door, carrying the tools of their illegal trade. Agent Kim called me, her voice filled with barely suppressed excitement. A flawless operation, we have them on breaking and entering, conspiracy to commit civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and about 6 other federal offenses. Additionally, everything we've gathered points to systematic racketeering that crosses state lines. Judge Jamie was watching the live feed of the arrests over my shoulder, his face a mix of satisfaction and professional gravity. Mr. Kelly, you have just assisted us in documenting one of the most unambiguous cases of civil rights conspiracy that I have encountered in my 3 decades on the federal bench. But the saga was far from concluded. During the arrest, federal agents had confiscated Brenda's phone, which revealed a network of similar operations in 6 states. Bank records exposed money laundering activities involving dozens of real estate deals. Email servers held evidence of the systematic targeting of military families going back 5 years. Dale confessed within hours, providing full cooperation in exchange for a lighter sentence. His testimony laid bare the full extent of Brenda's network. 43 HOAs employing identical tactics, over 200 veteran families systematically harassed out of their homes, and millions in illicit profits laundered through shell companies. As I drove back toward Pine Lake that evening, knowing that Brenda was spending her first night in federal detention, the Montana sunset appeared different. Through my windshield, justice was no longer just an abstract idea. It was federal agents with badges, prosecutors with subpoenas, and a legal system that finally possessed sufficient evidence to shield families like mine. The following day would bring media scrutiny, a community reckoning, and the start of genuine reform for HOAs across the nation. The steps of the federal courthouse in Helena had never seen a crowd of this magnitude. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed toward a clear Montana sky that seemed to hold the promise of justice. The scent of exhaust from idling vehicles mingled with the crisp November air as journalists from CNN, Fox News, and 3 major networks readied themselves for what U.S. Attorney Morrison had billed as a landmark announcement in civil rights enforcement. I stood next to Judge Jamie, still finding it hard to believe that less than 48 hours earlier, I was just a homeowner struggling against an HOA. Now, I was the primary witness in what federal prosecutors were describing as the most extensive coordinated housing discrimination case in the nation's history. Morrison walked to the podium with the self-assurance of someone who had spent months constructing an unassailable case. Behind her, Agent Kim clutched a thick folder filled with evidence that was set to redefine how HOAs functioned throughout the country. Ladies and gentlemen, Morrison began, her voice resonating clearly across the courthouse plaza. Today, we are announcing a 47-count federal indictment against Brenda Thornwick and 12 co-conspirators for systematic civil rights violations, racketeering, and conspiracy to defraud military families of their constitutional housing rights. The assembly of reporters erupted with shouted questions, and camera flashes created a strobe-like effect against the courthouse's granite exterior, but Morrison had more bombshells to drop. Operation Clean Sweep has exposed a criminal enterprise spanning 6 states, which targeted over 200 veteran families for methodical harassment and financial exploitation. The defendants accumulated approximately $2.3 million in illegal profits by compelling below-market property sales through fabricated violations and discriminatory enforcement. Beyond the media frenzy, I recognized some familiar faces from Pine Lake. Tom Rivera had made the trip with Margaret Jamie, along with several other neighbors who had quietly backed my efforts. Even Gladys was present, her eyes shining with the contentment of seeing Harold's memory honored. But the most gratifying sight was the federal prisoner transport van parked behind the courthouse, its darkened windows concealing Brenda during what would be her sole public appearance in an orange jumpsuit. Morrison proceeded with prosecutorial exactitude. The evidence includes recorded conversations in which the defendants explicitly discussed targeting military problems and upgrading neighborhood demographics. We have documented more than 400 instances of fabricated violations, fraudulent inspections carried out by unlicensed individuals, and systematic financial harassment based entirely on the veterans' military service. A reporter from the Washington Post called out a question that pierced the morning air. What signal does this send to other HOAs that engage in similar conduct? Morrison's smile was as sharp as a razor. Federal civil rights laws take precedence over any HOA authority. Discriminatory enforcement based on military status is a federal crime with no statute of limitations. Your financial records are accessible to the public. Your emails can be subpoenaed, and veterans have influential allies. A murmur of approval went through the crowd, but Judge Jamie stepped up to offer the judicial viewpoint that would make national news. For 30 years on the federal bench, I have witnessed civil rights violations masked as bureaucratic process, he stated, his voice imbued with the authority of legal precedent. This case affirms that systematic housing discrimination will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law, no matter how it is disguised or rationalized. A CNN correspondent inquired about the broader consequences, and Morrison delivered what prosecutors would later term the mic drop moment of the press conference. To the HOA board, members who are watching this broadcast, we have identified 847 similar complaints nationwide. Federal investigators are currently examining patterns of discriminatory enforcement in 23 states. If you are systematically targeting military families, protected minorities, or any group based on class membership rather than legitimate rule violations, we will find you, we will prosecute you, and we will seize every asset you have acquired through civil rights violations. The courthouse steps were a flurry of camera flashes and shouted follow-up questions. But the legal thunder had already resounded across the country. Social media was alight with hashtags like #HOAccountability. Local news outlets started to investigate the practices of their own community HOAs. Law firms specializing in civil rights declared that they were reviewing comparable cases in numerous states. Behind the media spectacle, the human toll was finally being addressed. Pete Michaels, the Desert Storm veteran who had been coerced into selling his property for $180,000, stood with tears in his eyes as Morrison announced that federal restitution would not only recover his losses but also provide damages for emotional distress. Every family that was targeted will be fully compensated. Morrison affirmed, federal asset forfeiture has already confiscated $2.8 million from the defendant's accounts, properties, and business assets. As the press conference wrapped up, I was mobbed by reporters asking for my thoughts on witnessing justice being served. But the most significant moment occurred when a young woman wearing a military spouse pin approached me discreetly. "My husband is deployed, and our HOA has been threatening us with violations that are completely made up," she whispered. "Who can I contact?" I gave her Agent Kim's business card. "The federal government is paying attention now," I told her. "You are no longer fighting this battle alone." The Montana wind carried our words across the courthouse plaza, where justice had at last found a voice powerful enough to be heard from coast to coast. 6 months after Brenda's perp walk became a national story, Pine Lake had evolved into something that would have brought tears of pride to my grandfather's eyes. A true community where the scent of barbecue and laughter filled the air, replacing the previous atmosphere of whispered anxieties. Brenda was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $2.8 million in restitution, a debt that will haunt her for the rest of her life. Dale, who cooperated fully with federal investigators, received a 3-year sentence and became a key witness in prosecutions in 4 other states. His testimony was instrumental in dismantling similar discrimination networks from Idaho to Wyoming, safeguarding over 400 military families from the kind of systematic harassment we had faced. But the most important outcome was this: seeing Emma sleep soundly once more, no longer startled awake by the sound of car doors in our driveway. Watching Sarah's shoulders finally relax as she tended to our garden, the perpetual stress at last dissipating like spring snow. Our family had not only weathered a federal investigation but, more significantly, had taken back our home. The financial restitution was both swift and thorough. Federal asset forfeiture confiscated everything: Brenda's real estate business, her personal assets, and even the immaculate white SUV she had used for her nocturnal surveillance. Every family that had been targeted received complete compensation, along with damages. For emotional distress, Pete Michaels used his $180,000 recovery to purchase a stunning lakefront cabin, humorously noting that Brenda had inadvertently provided him with his dream retirement home. The newly formed HOA board, with me as its unanimously chosen president, established a system of governance so transparent it was practically visible from orbit. All meetings are now live-streamed, and independent auditors review our finances quarterly. Most importantly, we incorporated anti-discrimination clauses that would ensure no one could ever again be targeted because of their military service, race, or background. Property values surged as the national media attention drew families who were seeking neighbors who stood up for what was right. Young military couples began to move to Pine Lake specifically because they had learned of our stand against discrimination. The community that Brenda had attempted to corrupt with hatred, we had cleansed through inclusivity. The healing process reached its peak with our inaugural Freedom Day celebration, now an annual event held on the anniversary of Brenda's arrest. The entire community convened around tables where former adversaries now enjoyed Emma's homemade cookies and traded fishing tales. The sound of children's laughter bounced off the same lake where Brenda once roamed with her clipboard of fabricated violations. The true highlight, however, was the establishment of our Pine Lake Veteran Scholarship, financed by federal restitution and driven by community spirit. We now offer full college scholarships to the children of military members who have experienced housing discrimination anywhere in the country. Just last month, I presented a scholarship check to Maria Santos, whose Army father had been harassed out of 3 different neighborhoods before finding a safe haven with us. As I watched her tears of gratitude, I could feel my grandfather's spirit beaming with pride from that old dock. Our case has become the legal precedent that has dismantled HOA corruption across the nation. Federal prosecutors have cited our evidence in 43 similar cases. Law schools now use our story as the benchmark for civil rights enforcement. Even a Netflix documentary has educated millions about the reality of systematic housing discrimination masquerading as community standards. the Department of Justice invited me to contribute to the drafting of national HOA oversight legislation, which has already been enacted in 12 states. Sarah and I now act as mentors to families engaged in similar struggles, connecting them with federal resources that are available because we refuse to back down. Every call our hotline receives represents another triumph over the Brendas of the world. This morning, I am sitting on my grandfather's renovated dock, with steam rising from a cup of coffee that tastes of freedom. Loons call across the water, so clear that it mirrors every cloud, every new possibility. The dock that nearly cost me everything now serves as the venue for community fishing tournaments, where veterans teach local children how to cast a line and share stories of courage in the face of adversity. The cabin's weathered but resilient cedar walls now house a retreat center, where military families can find solace among neighbors who know that service forges bonds far stronger than any HOA regulation. The creaking of the old wood beneath my boots now sounds like victory. Not a violation. Justice took time, it took bravery, and it took people who were willing to stand up and say no more. But it arrived wearing federal badges and was enforced with constitutional authority. Your own HOA nightmare might be the next federal case. Share your worst experience in the comments below. You might be surprised by how many laws they've broken, and your story could help another family achieve justice. Click that subscribe button for HOA and hit that notification bell, because next week, I'll be covering the city council member who tried to appropriate an entire neighborhood park and how one grandmother, armed with public records, took down City Hall. Another day, another HOA drama resolved. If the story made you shake your head or pump your fist in triumph, smash that like button, share your own HOA experience below, and subscribe so you never miss another battle in the BBS.